Enough already. Enough already. In the Yemen, this evening, 50 children have been slaughtered, beheaded by the Saudi Arabian Air Force. That's 50 small school children in a school bus, bombed by the Saudi Arabian Air Force, deploying bombs and rockets sold to them by us, by Great Britain, by the United States of America. A command and control cell staffed by on-loan British and American officers commands the Saudi forces in the war against Yemen, the poorest country in the Middle East. Thousands upon thousands have been slaughtered in this senseless conflict over one of the poorest patches of earth. It is an utter scandal that we continue to kiss the noses and any other part of the anatomy required of this medieval barbarism that calls itself Saudi Arabia. 50 children in one go! At one time, imagine your child was on that school bus. 1 second, the children are happily going home from school, and the next, they are ash. They are burning corpses, just like that. I don't know how they're going to get out of this one. I know that the Saudis don't give a damn. Not a damn. Last night, they beheaded a convicted Burmese prisoner and then crucified him, minus his head. These are our friends in the East. They're our best friends in the East. They're our best friends in the East for whom we are turning the world upside down. We are dancing, belly dancing, to these belly dancers, these grotesque hulks that need a block and tackle to lift them off their golden thrones. And for what? For money? How dirty does your money have to be before it'll make us turn our noses up in the face of it? I'm going to argue tonight that there can be no case for selling weapons to the Saudi Arabian dictatorship, whilst it massacres its neighbours in an illegal, aggressive war of choice, and whilst it suppresses a very substantial portion of its own people. Because according to our law, it is illegal to sell weapons to any country if those weapons might be used for internal repression or external aggression. In this case, guilty on both counts. Now guess what? The much maligned Jeremy Corbyn, more than a year ago, tabled exactly that motion in the House of Commons. Actually, it was milder than that. It was that Saudi Arabian arms sales should be suspended pending an international investigation into reports of war crimes against the people of Yemen. And more than 100 Labour MPs broke a 3-line whip and abstained on the motion. Imagine. And what a grisly crew they were. What a surprising crew they were. One of them was Ben Bradshaw, an openly out gay MP, breaking a Labour 3-line whip in defence of a Saudi Wahhabi ideology that throws men like him off high buildings. People who would never dream of condoning the death penalty in any other country, including the United States of America, broke a 3-line whip in defence of Saudi Arabia. women Labour MPs, feminist Labour MPs broke a 3-line whip in defence of Saudi Arabia. I argued here and elsewhere. At the time, Jeremy Corbyn should have drawn that line in the sand. Because guess what? That 100 Labour MPs keep cropping up over and over and over again. Not least on the crime that took place last night in Gaza, where amongst many others, a young pregnant mother and her 14-month-old baby girl were murdered by Israeli warplanes, by the state whose friends in the British Parliament demand that Jeremy Corbyn bow the knee and surrender to them. I told Corbyn to draw the line in the sand on the Saudi vote, and if he had, he wouldn't be in the trouble he's now in, with exactly the same members of Parliament. It's not that I can see into the future. It's not that I'm a clairvoyant. If I was, maybe I should do the football pools. It's that I know what's really going on. And I know for whom people are really working. I know from what they say, and I know from the way that they say it. And Jeremy Corbyn is even older than me, been in politics just as long as me. And I interviewed today a man called Mark Wadsworth, a black civil rights activist in Labour politics in Britain for more than 40 years. A comrade of Jeremy Corbyn's, who was thrown to the wolves, as so many have been. Comrade after comrade after comrade, thrown to the wolves, one by one by one, in the hope that the wolves will go away. But you can't keep a wolf happy until you're dead and in its belly. We'll be talking about all these issues tonight, and you can have your say. 0344 499 1000. And we're going to return to Boris Johnson. I am aghast. Not at the Tommy Robinson type lumpen thugs that are lining up to support the old Etonian tuck shop toff Boris Johnson, because I knew that that would happen. But the liberals, the nice people who are lining up to my own face, telling me that they support Boris Johnson's comments. I hate burqas. I hate niqabs. I hate to see them. But it's none of my business. It's none of my business what Cass, my producer, wears, or what colour her hair is, or whether she covers up her hair, or whether she's wearing drawers. It's none of my business. It's none of anybody's business what a woman wears. Not least because this isn't about what they wear at all. After all, most of the people opining about burqas don't even know what a burqa is. Don't even know the difference between a burqa and a niqab. Don't know the difference between a burqa and a niqab and a hijab, which is merely a head square, as my old mother would have called it. And once you ban the burqa, you'll ban the niqab. And once you've banned the burqa and the niqab, it won't be long before you're demanding that you ban the hijab. And then it won't be long before you say, what about these Jewish women in Stamford Hill? Their burqas are even more opaque than any burqa worn by any Muslim woman. There's not many of them, but there's not many women wearing burqas either. Most of the burqas that you'll see in Britain are being worn by Saudi Arabian tourists in London. Go to Harrods. You'll see hundreds of people in burqas. What are you going to do? You're going to ban Saudi tourists from London? How will that work? Are you going to insist that a Saudi woman coming to Britain for a holiday has to dress differently? Take off her scarf? Take off her cloak? Bare her face so you can look at it as you fleece her for another price of another ice cream cone or another ring of emeralds or diamonds from British stores? Think about the track that you are on. And once you ban them, what about the Sikhs? You going to ban turbans? You going to stop people covering their hair? Well, you'll need to ban Sikhs from wearing turbans. Now let me put my cards on the table. I love Sikhs. All of my life I've loved them. The first friend of colour I ever had was a Sikh, Charan Singh Atwan, and a beautiful person he was, and a beautiful man he was, with his black turban. I've never forgotten it, though it's 45 years since I set eyes upon him. I can still see him in my eyes when I see Sikh people being abused and repressed, either here or in Prime Minister Modi's India. The Sikh people are part of the land of the Punjab. The land of the Punjab is rising up this weekend, manifested in Trafalgar Square, and I'll be there, demanding the peaceful right of self-determination, demanding not an uprising, not an armed struggle, demanding a piece of paper on which they can put an X to determine their relationship to Mr. Modi's India, demanding an end to bigotry and discrimination and state violence against Sikh people. I stand with the Sikhs. I stand with Sikhs for justice. Where do you stand? And we'll be interviewing one of the leaders of that peaceful campaign for a referendum in the Punjab in the course of this show. It's also Book Lovers Day. I'm a book lover. Are you? There are too few now, aren't there? How many people do you see reading books now? Once upon a time, you got on the London Underground, everybody was reading a book. Those that weren't reading a book were reading a newspaper. Now they're all reading their telephones. Books have changed my life. In fact, I'll tell you the book that changed my life. You might never have heard of it. It was by a man called Laurie Lee. It was called As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. It was a Penguin classic. I read it, and I never stopped reading again. So I want to hear from you. Which books made a difference to you? Which books changed your life? Which books do you recommend that others read so that they might change theirs? It's going to be the mother of all talk shows. It's World Book Lovers Day. Paperbacks, hardbacks. I'd be happy to see people reading books of any hardness of back, because books matter. They really can change the world. Give me your suggestions, your responses on that, will you? Professor Natasha Ezro is Director of Education at the University of Essex and is a Middle East specialist. And she joins us now as we try to come to terms with the extraordinary event that happened this day in the Yemen. Professor Ezro, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Would you be able to add to our knowledge, how did this happen and what have the Saudis said about it?
Well, Well, it's just the Saudis claimed that they were retaliating to a Houthi ballistic missile that targeted the Jizan province in Saudi Arabia Wednesday night. So they claim it's a legal military action. But in the end, they hit a bus that had dozens of children on it, many under 10, in northern Yemen. And I think they said there's somewhere like 43 killed and 63 injured. And many have been critical of the Saudi attacks. It's something to kind of add about the Saudis in their attacks of civilians. A lot of the deaths in this war have been civilians. But they say that about 2/3 of the civilian deaths have been due to Saudi attacks. So this is just one in many of a string of attacks where the Saudis claim it's part of a military action, deliberately trying to tackle the Houthis, but where the real casualties seem to be not just civilians, but also children.
It is a potential tipping point, I would have thought. It's very difficult in Britain and in the United States once the enormity of this disaster begins to spread to justify our continuing involvement in the war, don't you think?
Well, you would think. But the other thing that I've noticed is that the death toll is also inaccurate. So it's been hovering supposedly around 10,000 people for a very long time, which doesn't seem that would match all the deaths that are taking place. But there was a recent article even in the Washington Post that said they think that the death toll may be as high as 50,000. So we're not getting a lot of press about the Yemen civil war in general. It's overshadowed by all kinds of other things going on in the world. And because of Yemen's proximity to Saudi Arabia, it seems that both the U.S. and the U.K. Are letting sort of Saudi Arabia take the lead on this to stabilize the region. And I don't see the U.S. administration doing anything different because the Trump administration is particularly close to the Saudis. And I don't really see the British administration doing anything different either. I'm sure that there's always condemnations of these types of attacks. Of course, the UN was critical of the Saudi attack as well. But with Yemen, there hasn't been really a strong firm hand to deal with some of these Saudi civilian attacks in any way, shape, or form.
How could anyone in their right mind describe what's happening as stabilizing?
It's been very destabilizing. Since the Saudis have been involved, they've been contributing hugely to the humanitarian crisis because they've caused most of the blockade of food. Yemen has to import in all its food, and that's why we have a major humanitarian crisis. We have 22 million people that are in need of humanitarian aid. You have children, just all the children in Yemen, that's 11 million of them, all of them are in need of humanitarian assistance. And this has been mostly blamed on the Saudis and the way that they have attempted to, as you said, stabilize the region.
And then there's the matter of cholera.
The cholera is just killing everybody as well. You have 1 million people that have been affected by the cholera outbreak. But this is also hampered by the fact that only like 40% of the hospitals are even functioning. So they can't really even deal with the crisis of the cholera. And then on top of that, deal with all the civilian death toll that is unusually high. As I think I said before, it's about 2/3 of the civilians are killed in this crisis.
And so your expert prediction is, and I don't say that at all pejoratively, I feel you may be right. Your expert prediction is that the massacre of a bus full of children will not likely move the administrations either in London or in Washington.
No, not at all. Because Yemen is so low in terms of priorities for any of the Western countries as to what to do about it or how to solve it. And I think this is the same thing that happened to Somalia, where everybody sort of agrees that this is an unsolvable crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis we can't really fix. It's too difficult to go in there. And it is true. It is very difficult for humanitarian aid to reach Yemen. But I think it's been put in the same category as Somalia as, we just really can't do much about it, and we're just going to let it kind of play out.
Of course, the negation of that is that we are involved in Yemen. We're supplying the weapons. We've got officers involved in the military command and control.
Right, but that isn't the same as the press that you would see if we started to get really involved with ground troops and trying to stabilize the region, and then even actually trying to go against the Saudis in some way. We see this, the West probably sees this, as many people see this, as sort of a Cold War or a rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And therefore, because the West is very closely tied with Saudi Arabia, and because the West is very anti-Iran, that they're going to side on the side of Saudi Arabia in this and allow the Saudis to benefit from, millions and millions of, Western weapons, aid that benefits the Saudi coalition.
A prisoner was last night both beheaded and crucified. The number of beheadings this year, 2018, by the Saudi regime is higher than the number of known beheadings by ISIS. Does none of this turn anyone's stomach?
That's the thing about the Saudis, and you saw, if we're going to kind of take this back historically about the way the U.S. responded to 9/11, even though most of the hijackers were Saudis, the links between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are so incredibly strong and deep. And you can add to that the British as well. It's a very, very strong relationship there that is not really going to break much. It suffered under the Obama administration, but it's stronger than ever under the Trump administration. And so you could see in the way that there was a Muslim ban in the U.S. that Saudi Arabia was conveniently not listed as one of the countries that was banned, even though the Saudi regime is probably one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world. And at some point was passively supporting groups that were very dangerous to Western countries.
Professor Natasha Ezro, thank you again for joining us, Director of Education at the University of Essex, and a Middle East specialist and a Middle East pessimist, as one would have to be in the face of all of this. Continuing our theme of National Book Lovers Day, International, World Book Lovers Day, Watership Down. Very beautiful song. Was that Art Garfunkel? Very, very, very beautiful song. Now, a madman called Tottenham says, George Galloway opens his show with the words, quote, enough already, unquote. We saw that on the front page of Private Eye. We know what the anti-Semitic, spelt wrongly, Galloway was saying. I think an apology would be in order. What are you talking about? What front page? Of which Private Eye? You utter maniac. Caroline says, I thought you was going to talk about the deportations involving the Rochdale grooming atrocity tonight, George Galloway. Then again, nobody seems to care about these poor abused children. That's from Caroline in Manchester. Patience, Caroline. I will be. Now, let me turn to the wave of communications. This one from Donny. Evening, George. I know you've said that the Jews don't run the banks, media, politics, but who do you think does? After some YouTubing on Freemasons, I now think the Masonic secret societies do. It's all connected. Donny, you'll disappear down a rabbit hole. Do you want to know who owns the banks, the media, and politics? It's the capitalists. They don't have an ethnicity or a religion or even a lodge in common. It's the capitalists what own it, and they own it and they use it to make more and more and more money. If you start to look for ethnic groups, religions, or even Masonic lodges as the key to everything that we face, you'll disappear down a rabbit hole, a conspiracy theory rabbit hole. Tear your eyes away from it, Donny. Take my advice. Claudie says, hashtag BBC switch off. There's a big, I can tell, BBC switch off going on at the moment. I hope everyone's tuning in to talk radio instead. And Claudie says, BBC switch off and tune in on Talk Radio with George Galloway for an unbiased discussion where facts are paramount and the truth is not distorted. And Christopher Dalsky Rogerskioff, that's a spoof name for Christopher Rogers, I think, the 100 plus Labour MPs who failed to support Corbyn and the Whip in condemning arms sales to Saudi Arabia, each have blood on their hands with this vile attack against kids in Yemen by the Saudis. They and the murdering Saudis disgust me utterly. Well, that's strong words, Christopher, and I entirely endorse them. The blood of those MPs is, the blood of those children is on the hands of those MPs. Amanda says, question for you, Gigi, with regards to your statement about the Yemen, when was the last time this country of ours had any integrity? Roughly 1940 to 41. Terry Eaton said, George, your opening remarks were extremely powerful and emotional. Not one MP should vote to support this barbaric, inhumane regime in Saudi Arabia. They are the same as the murderers in Israel, and anyone who does support them should be sacked. Terry, they're much, much worse than that. Let me skip forward. This is from Terry. George, poor old Boris made the fatal mistake of offending Muslims, which no doubt will finish off his career as a politician and could cost him his life if ISIS get their hands on him, says Terry from Croydon. And David Leviscont says, psychos are running the country. It seems that murdering children is fine, so long as they are the right kind of children. Where's the USA, UK and France now, quick to bomb Syria? And yes, they are sending bombs to Saudi, but only for them to kill more children. Sick. Sick indeed, David. Lee Gazy says, us London cabbies would have a very quiet summer in Knightsbridge if they banned the burqa. What a very, very powerful point. And Marie McFarlane, my old friend, says, evening, big man. I loved Cider with Rosie by Laurie Lee and have an illustrated version. My first book as a child was Emile and the Detectives by Erich Kästner, about a young boy with a package of money being followed in London. I haven't read that one, Marie, and of course I wasn't including all the books from Noddy to I don't know what, the annuals, the Beano, the Dandy and so on. I wasn't including them. I was actually charting it from my turning point in my life, which those of you who've read or listened to my autobiography will know, was when I switched from being the school tough guy to the school carrying penguins around under his arms boy, which was a turning point for me. And a group of boys were seminal in making me make that switch. The preeminent amongst them, Billy Duncan, became himself a penguin author. Indeed, I was a penguin author at exactly the same time as him, and he helped very, very much to change my life. Cider with Rosie was the book that led me on to As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. Cider with Rosie was a wonderful, wonderful novel by Laurie Lee, but I learned from the back of it that he'd written a subsequent book about his trip to Spain to fight with the International Brigade, and that's the one called As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. Very, very important to me. And I should mention Mr. Bennett, Mr. Richard Bennett, my English teacher, who also played a really important part in my life. David Woolnough says, top of my pops is The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists, a socialist Bible, and so true today. Amen to that, David. And David, another David, says, how many Labour MPs regret not voting today, Ben? Shame on them all. That's addressed to Ben Bradshaw. The Labour rebels who didn't back the Yemen vote have blood on their hands. And there's a link, actually, to the list of them. Everyone should consult it. You won't be surprised at the names you find. Richard Red Star says, great start, George. You're right about the 100 or so Labour MPs that keep attacking Corbyn. Remember what Fidel Castro said about Batista. He should have killed me when he had the chance. Metaphorically speaking, of course, Corbyn should have killed off their power and influence. And Marek says, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States is a must, especially for young people. I give a copy of it to new high school graduates so their eyes will be opened. Howard Zinn, what a man. And Transcender says, listening to the mother of all talk shows on talk radio, on YouTube from Spain. You quoted Machado's poem, Walker, there is no path. The path is made by walking. Mercado himself had to flee Spain after the defeat of the Republic during the Spanish Civil War. Thank you for that. And Ditu says, our favourite books, No Logo by Naomi Klein and Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. One fiction, one fact, but both stories about monsters created by man. Perfectly put, Ditu. And Tony from Stirling says, from a political point of view, the books that have inspired me the most have been When the Clyde Ran Red by Maggie Craig and Liberation Theology by Philip Berryman. I'd suggest some of the so-called Corbynites have a read, and they'll see what the true radical left looks like. Let's take a break for some capitalist messages. Oh, the great Elvis Costello. Every day I write a book. This is World Book Lovers Day, so there'll be a bookish theme throughout. Happy birthday to my old friend Mike Graham, by the way. I actually interviewed someone today who shares a birthday with both Donald Trump and Che Guevara. Get your head round that. Wayne Mack says, like you, George, I love a Graham Greene novel. Putting aside the deserved Rees-Mogg jibes, Greene takes us back to an innocent age, bereft of social media, yet highlights the skullduggery our government gets up to. Our man in Havana is pure comedic genius. Well, Graham Greene was a very considerable genius. I had the great honour to meet him, indeed pick him up at Heathrow Airport to take him to a meeting late in his life. Of course, Our Man in Havana, The Quiet American, Brighton Rock, so many wonderful books written by a wonderful man. Let's hear from Daniel in Addleston. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Yeah, good evening, George. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Nice to hear from you. What would you like to say?
Well, it's about you mentioning about Yemen again, and well, obviously the corporate media don't talk about it, but again, this thing of 10,000 people keep dying all the time. Is it 10,000 a time or 10,000?
Well, that's a good question. As the professor was saying earlier, it's much more likely to be 50,000 plus than it is to be 10. Well, and that's before you talk about the cholera and the starvation.
It's been going on for 3 years, and I think there was these horrible numbers about Raqqa in Iraq, is it? Iraq,
in Syria.
Syria. Syria. But more artillery was dropped on that place in a few months, and the whole Vietnam War and all this kind of. So was it every 13 minutes there's a military airstrike somewhere?
Well, you raise a very good point, Daniel. And there are people out there, perhaps some are listening, who think, well, hey, Yemen, far-off country of which we know little, poor people, not much we can do, can't access them, etc. And therefore they turn their faces away. It's not something any religious believer or anyone with a heart, in my view, could ever do. But that's what a lot of people do. But compare and contrast. Syria is a far-off country of which we know little. Yeah. The Syrian children are Arab children. But we risked World War III. World War III just a couple of months ago, when a fake, fraudulent chemical weapons attack took place in Douma. We were told, Daniel, this is unconscionable. We cannot tolerate this. We must act. And hundreds of millions of pounds of weaponry was brought to bear. But not only does nobody lift a finger about the children in Yemen, we sell the weapons that killed the children in Yemen. Go on.
Saudi Arabia has got twice as many British-made planes as the British Air Force. Yeah, that's a good thing to think about.
And we've got Air Force officers on secondment in Saudi Arabia now.
Will not this bus... I mean, again, this is just today's horrific incident, but is it not that because the Saudis aren't, dare I say it, they're not, they have the British helping them, like, pick the targets.
Yes, for sure, for sure. They're not capable of hitting a school bus on their own. They've got a military command and control cell which is staffed by British and American military officers on secondment. Those rockets and bombs today were guided in by British and American officers.
And again, we don't know about our drone program as well, because there's a freedom of information request about where you go to dronewars.org, and it talks about in Syria and Afghanistan from 2013 to 2017, 1.35 billion has been spent on drones. But this is British, not American. This is British money. Yeah, you go to dronewars.org, and it tells you how much money the British have spent. And again, it's through a freedom of information request that they've done that. So maybe people need to get on the case about doing a...
Well, I'm on the case, and so are you, and let's hope our listeners get on the case. You got a last point?
Johnson, I think he's a Russian agent because he qualifies. He does double speak. He's malign activities. He's got wafting air like old Trotsky and the Marxists. They had wafting air as well, didn't they?
And his name's Boris. What more evidence do you need?
Name.
What more? I mean, he's got snow on his boots. I saw him once. Daniel Adelson, thanks a lot. Paul Booker says, George, if your listeners haven't read it yet, I highly recommend The Candidate, Jeremy Corbyn's Improbable Path to Power by Alex Nuns. It's a fascinating and highly informative book. Indeed it is. I have it. Indeed, we interviewed him more than once. Ian Puddick, my old friend, says, Hi GG, it's Banned Books Week. Banned Books Week, September 23. It's a must for book readers. Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers by former MI5 officers David Shaler and Annie Machen. God's Spy by Annie Machen. Proud to call them friends. Well, I don't know him, but I certainly am much impressed by her. John Hodgkin says, George, why are you emphasising the idea of banning things? It's the mainland European liberal Islamophobes who are falling over themselves to ban the burqa. No serious UK politician is advocating such a stupid policy. Book, I'm currently reading a biography of Leon Blum by Pierre Birnbaum. He was the Prime Minister of France in the late 1930s, a socialist and a Jew at an extremely difficult time. An inspiring read. Cheers, John Hodgkins. Well, because what other than a ban, or worse than a ban, the terror, the fear of wearing garments that you want to wear could possibly result from the kind of incendiary attack that Boris Johnson made. There's more than one way of skinning a cat, and there's more than one way of banning a burqa. The Communicipalist says the mother of all talk shows is an oasis of rationality in a desert of fake news, post-truth politics, and false flag attacks on rationality and evidence-based current affairs. Don't miss it. Goodness, I wish I'd written that. Thank you very much indeed. If we had an advertising agency, that's what it would say. And Denny, not my boss, another Denny, says, Israelis slaughter Palestinians and we do nothing. Atrocities continue in Yemen, mass murder by Saudis, and we continue to arm them. I despair of the Westminster windbags. Keep broadcasting the truth, George. Denny, I don't despair because despair is the road to retirement. Despair is the road to giving up. And I will never, ever, ever give up. Not while God gives me breath. Rose is in London on her favourite book. Rose, welcome to the show.
Hello, George. How are you?
Good, thanks. Nice to hear from you.
I've got two.
Go on.
I've got Ghassan Kanafani, Men in the Sun.
Yeah, wonderful.
And Che Guevara by John Lee Anderson.
Yes, well, I've got both of those books. Ghassan was a giant in my early political development, and yes. Che Guevara is my number one hero. So I'm right with you on those. It's a very, there are many biographies of Che, but the Anderson one is the best, isn't it?
Do you think?
I do, yeah, I do. Until I write
Brilliant.
one. Until I write one. I hope you've read my Fidel Castro handbook, have you?
I have. I've got it.
Excellent.
Yes, it's
Excellent.
amazing.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. God bless you, Rose.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the call. Appreciate that. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. You can email through the website at talkradio.co.uk. You can text the word talk followed by your message to 87222. That'll cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. Or you can tweet me at George Galloway at Talk Radio. Don't forget to at both of us. David says, our government and media are complicit in the murder of women and children in one of the poorest countries on earth. Two-faced politicians. That's an understatement, David. Bradley Northcote says, expect a rabid reaction should Britain stand in condemnation of Saudi atrocities. Canada's foreign ministry belatedly criticised the Saudi regime after selling them armed vehicles. And look at the result. Yep, indeed. Britain's richest man, Sir Jim Ratcliffe, an ardent Brexiteer, is deserting the UK to live in Monaco, where residents pay no tax. Says a lot, eh, Galloway? That's from The Madman. Every night, every hour, dozens, scores actually, of 25 pence a time texts. Does your wife know that you spend your life like this? And by the way, whoever Sir Jim is, I've never heard of him. Bob Justice, I've heard you refer to your openers as a soliloquy. That was so much more. A truth bomb. Precision in nature. Straight on target. Sans the loss of a human life. A masterclass in broadcasting. Every public figure covering up for Saudi should listen and think. Bob, that's very powerful, and I'm deeply grateful for it. Let's hear from Sam. Go ahead, Sam.
Hi, George. First-time call.
Welcome.
To any radio show.
Which part of the country are you calling from?
Calling from, the M25 at the moment,
Okay.
the way to Gerrard's Cross.
All right, my friend. Go ahead.
George, the Jewish lobby has shown just how powerful and sort of influential they are, having caused havoc in the Labour Party. I'm just wondering whether or not they should use some of that influence to support Muslim women who are now being under threat from this whole burqa nonsense from Boris.
Well, I'm still waiting for Dame Margaret Hodge to march up to Boris Johnson and scream in his face, you're an effing racist. I think I'll wait a long time for that. I don't call them the Jewish lobby, Sam. I call them the Blairite lobby, because that's what they really are. They're weaponizing this issue of anti-Semitism. That's true. But it could equally be any other matter. It could be Brexit, could be any other matter. Could be the Yemen, could be Saudi Arabia, could be Russia. Indeed, it's been all of those things. This is a lobby determined to remove Jeremy Corbyn. And Labour has an Israel problem, not a Jewish problem. They're two different things. Go ahead, Sam.
Well, strangely enough, I mean, the whole point is I find it very difficult to talk on the subject because I don't know what you're allowed to say these days. So, because the whole debate about anti-Semitism has been tied down to you cannot talk about Israel.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you. I'll tell you what I saw tonight, and I wish I'd thought of it and much earlier. Somebody said that Corbyn should have, at the beginning, come out with a definition of anti-Semitism and said anyone who falls foul of this will be expelled, disciplined, and will not be welcome in the Labour Party. But we will not allow any reference to Israel in a definition about anti-Semitism in Britain. He should have drawn that line very firmly right from the start, because Israel is a foreign state. Its conduct of its affairs is as legitimate a subject for condemnation as the subject of Saudi Arabia. When we attack Saudi Arabia, as I did vehemently earlier this evening, I'm not, of course, and only a madman would imagine, I'm attacking Muslims or I'm attacking Islam. I'm attacking Saudi Arabia, a political state. And when I attack what Israel did in Gaza last night, equally, I'm not attacking Jews or Judaism. I'm attacking the political state of Israel. It's really not rocket science, Sam.
George, I agree with you. And I think they've actually devalued the word anti-Semitism.
Yes.
To the extent that they've actually thrown real Jewish people under the bus.
Yeah, they have. It's very, very dangerous what they've done. Reckless in the extreme. And for so-called leaders of a minority community, I have no idea what they think they are achieving with this. Somebody, Dave, says, Sir, I have been unfortunate in having lived under 3 Labour governments, spelt wrongly, since the late 60s, and everyone has bankrupted the country. Discuss this, says Dave. Bet you don't. Dave, give me a call, 0344 499 1000. Now, as I said earlier, I love the Sikh people. I love them and have all of my life, ever since my very first friend of colour, Mr. Charan Singh Atwan. I haven't seen him for 45 years, but he is in my eyes every time I think of or meet a member of the Sikh community here in Britain or in the United States, where they are present in significant numbers, or indeed, for that matter, in India. Now, there has been a long-standing demand in the Punjab for self-determination, for either an independent state, certainly a new relationship, a different constitutional relationship with the central government of India in New Delhi. Some will be in favour of devolution, home rule. Some will want an entirely independent state of the Punjab, which is, of course, divided already by the partition of India and Pakistan. A very significant part of the Punjab, therefore, lies across the border in Pakistan. But they are a common group of people with a common language, with a common culture, with common economic and social interests, and a common perception of themselves as a people. Thus, they meet the test, as the Scottish people do, of being a nation that has a right to self-determination. That's where I stand, and I'll be speaking for them and to them on Sunday afternoon in Trafalgar Square, where a new campaign kicks off. Not to demand separatism for the Punjab, not to demand independence for the Punjab, not to demand an armed struggle or an uprising in the Punjab. Do calm down, Mr. Indian Embassy. But to demand the right to put an X on a piece of paper which says how they would like to be governed. Now, Sikhs for Justice are the organisation concerned, and because I love Sikhs and love justice, I would have to be involved. And we have a guest from them on the show this evening, Gurpat Want Panum. Very nice of you to come in, sir, to the show. Tell us, if you would, what this campaign is about.
Good evening, George, and thank you for bringing me here.
Welcome.
Actually, you said it all. You love Sikhs and you love justice, and that's what Sikhism stands for. We have been seeking justice for the other communities for the last 200 years. We were part of the campaign of the Allied forces to bring independence to the whole world. But unfortunately...
A very significant part of the British Army over a long, long time.
Yes, and they were carrying Guru Granth Sahib in their turbans when they were fighting the war for the British. But unfortunately, after 1849, the annexation of Punjab with the British rule, when the British left 1947, they left Punjab at the mercy of India. That is the issue. And since 1950, once the Indian Constitution comes into existence, Sikhism, the largest religion with 30 million populace throughout the world, has been labeled as Hindus in the Indian Constitution. That's where the whole issue started. And the first attack on the most sacred place for the Sikh religion, Golden Temple, happened in 1955. So starting that movement for right to self-determination, to make sure that the Sikhs and the Punjab have a right for their language, a right to decide about their economic future, it ended with the invasion of June 1984, Indian Army storming the Golden Temple, where this religious, political and economical movement was started by Sant Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. And after the attack, which we all know with 70,000 armed troops storming a religious place with no provocation, but the Indian army planned it for more than 1 year. And we are not able to get any documents from the Indian government. Why did they storm the Golden Temple, except an onslaught on the Sikh religion with an intention to eliminate, to exterminate a religious minority in India. And once the Sikh temple was invaded, of course, there was resistance from the community, from the Sikh population, to make sure that their rights are protected. And then comes the counter-insurgency operations of the Indian government, in which more than 150,000 individuals were butchered to death. Extrajudicial killings, torture. Not to remember November 1984, the genocidal violence of the Sikh community after the assassination of Indira Gandhi. So now this brings us back. Why do we seek independence? Why there should be a vote in Punjab? And why India still has a right to govern Punjab? That's where we come on August 12th under the international law with all the qualification that the Punjab should be reestablished as an independent country as it was in 1849.
If the people vote for it in the referendum.
That's all we are seeking. We are seeking a democratic vote. We are seeking a non-binding referendum just on the lines of Catalina, just on the line of Kurdistan, that we should have a right to vote whether the people of Punjab, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, whether they want to still India to govern the Punjab or they want Punjab to be an independent country, reestablish a separate nation.
Now, you're the legal advisor for Sikhs for Justice. So let me ask you some, on the face of it, technical questions. And you've just answered one of them. This campaign is not for independence, it's for a referendum on independence.
Exactly. Technically, it means the same thing because the question is a political question which we will be asking in the non-binding referendum whether the Punjab should be an independent country.
Yes. Well, we had one in Scotland, you see.
Yes.
And I campaigned against Scotland becoming an independent country. And my side won, 55-45. But nobody would have denied the Scottish people the right to hold that referendum. And in fact, no one can deny them the right to hold another one. And another one, if they so please, because they satisfy the definition of nationhood. A common people on a common piece of territory with a common language, a common culture, common economic and social interests, and a common conception of themselves as a people.
See, I understand. This is a political view. This is a dissenting political view, and we appreciate and we respect. But when it comes to India, any dissenting political views against the Modi government is called terrorism. That's an act of terrorism. And you can see from the time we have announced, we have planned a non-binding referendum rally in London, the Indian government has issued 3 different démarches and note verbals to the UK government asking them to force this rally to be blocked. They are trying to scuttle and suppress the freedom of expression of the Sikh community even in London. That is the issue. It's not the issue whether we are going to win non-binding referendum, whether people are going to vote against or in favor of us. We are okay. But we should be, as a Sikh community, as a Punjabis, we should be given the right to vote.
Now, that's exactly correct. And I can testify I'm already feeling the heat. As soon as I said I was going to speak at the rally, the conference on Sunday, I began to feel the heat, and there'll be more, I'm sure, following our interview this evening. So the long arm of the Indian government, who denied me a visa to Kashmir, by the way, on many, many occasions. In fact, they tried to do a vulgar trade with me.
So what is exactly they're hiding? That is the issue, George, we should all be talking about.
Quite so. Let me though come on to these other technical questions I want to ask you. Not everybody who lives in the Punjab is a Sikh. Indeed, the Punjab is divided between 2 states, India and Pakistan. Are you confining your campaign to the Indian side of the Punjab? And is it your contention that the Punjab as a whole, Christians, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, should form an independent state?
Yes, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, the Christians, all we share together is a common culture, common language, different religion. But that's what we want, a Punjab. But right now, we are working on a non-binding referendum and the Indian-governed, Indian-occupied Punjab, because we will be seeking votes, whether it should be an independent country or not. The time they are talking about the people are the part of the Pakistan Punjab. In whole of Pakistan, there are only 26,000 Sikhs. Why would we seek a vote in the country where there is a majority is Muslims?
What's the population? What's the population of the Punjab, Indian Punjab?
18 million Sikhs.
18 million.
Yes, out of that 22 to 25 million population, they have it. We are 18 million Sikhs.
25 million, so that would be a substantial sized country.
It is, of course, and with the most powerful economic resources, the wheat and the rice and the agriculture, what we produce, comes to the 40% share of the whole of the Indian agriculture produce, even though we form the tiniest of the states. But 40% of the produce goes to India. So that is almost 400 million people Punjab is feeding. So why we will not be able to have a country which is economically wealthy and strong under the Punjab governance?
Now, in the past, India had a government that called itself secular, at least, leftist, Congress, the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty. But India has a very different government now. It has an explicitly sectarian government.
Yes.
Some would call it a fanatic government. It certainly has its roots in organizations that have been associated with extreme violence, who killed Gandhi himself. It has an intolerant attitude to the minorities within the state and has intensified its repression of those minorities and, of course, of occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So this, it would seem to me, is one of the factors that has ripened the situation in your favour. Because if India had a government that was doing its best to be fair and to share India's newfound resources and wealth, and took the view that everyone had a place in India as an equal citizen, you'd be on a sticky wicket. But it's not, is it?
See, whatever you're saying, on the face of it, those are the right statements. But when it comes to the Sikhism, when it comes to the Sikhs, each and every government from 1978, whether it's a Congress government, whether it's a BJP-ruled government, Sikhs are facing the same Indian system which is responsible for the genocidal violence of the Sikh community. When it started in attack on June 1984 and the genocidal violence of November 1984, members of parliament from the Indian Congress were involved. Even the office bearers of the BJP, the ruling Modi government, was involved. So from Congress government to BJP government, each and every government is covering up the genocidal violence and harboring those who killed Sikhs. So when it comes to the Sikh community, they face the same system. Only thing they are changing is the face. The face is Rajiv Gandhi. The face was Manmohan Singh. The face can be Narasimha Rao, and face can be Modi. All those faces have the same harboring mentality when it comes to the killing of the Sikhs.
Okay, two further questions. What are the possibilities of the central government allowing such a referendum? And on the assumption that the possibilities are close to nil, if not nil, what do you do next? Can't you and might you organise an unofficial people's referendum? Like they did, for example, in Catalonia, as a means of showing the world what support there is. I don't know what support there is for an independent Punjab. And secondly, what are the possibilities, and the early signs are not good, that holding this campaign, starting this campaign, will not actually intensify the repression from Modi's government in New Delhi?
See, let's come to the first question. What are the possibilities of the Indian government allowing a referendum in the Punjab? I think it becomes the responsibility, and the onus is on the United Nations countries. The onus is on the United Kingdom, Britain, US and Europe, that if India calls itself the most powerful and the largest democracy in the world, why would they not allow a referendum? Why would not they allow a vote? Why would not they allow people to have their will whether they want to stay with India or not? While we are seeking a non-binding referendum, that's what exactly we are organizing in 2020. We are asking the people of the Punjab, we are asking the indigenous people of the Punjab globally that whether they want still India to govern Punjab or not. While having said that, any activist who is promoting a referendum in Punjab, including myself, I'm a New York-based human rights lawyer. I have been charged with the sedition cases in India. And most recently, any individual who is seeking or who's supporting or who's advocating for a referendum is being called terrorist. And dossiers are being, as we talk, dossiers are being sent to the UK government. You also said you are facing a long arm heat. And this is going to get intensified within next 2 days, as we all know. I think the onus is on the world powers to push India to give Sikhs the right to self-determination, the right to vote on the independence of Punjab.
Mr. Panam, the legal advisor of Sikhs for Justice, tell us finally, what are the arrangements for Sunday?
On Sunday at 3 p.m. Trafalgar Square, thousands and thousands of the Sikhs, because this will be the first global gathering of the Sikhs for a political purpose, for a non-binding referendum. Thousands are coming from the Europe and thousands will be gathering that day, and will be doing a London declaration where we will be unveiling a case for the Sikhs' right to self-determination as per the UN Covenant's civil and political rights, which gives and grants all peoples a right to self-determination.
Well, I hope the rain stays off and you have a fine gathering.
Thank you very much, George.
Not least because I'll be speaking there. See you then. Thank you, Mr. Panam, for joining us. This is the mother of all talk shows. What's that one? Great song, Yellow Brick Road, but what's the book? Is that the name of a book? Oh. I didn't know that. 0344 499 1000. It's World Book Lovers Day, and all of us book lovers are celebrating real books, not on a tiny smartphone screen, but real books that you can hold in your hand, that you can curl up with in bed. Georgia is in Spalding. How wonderful. Georgia, welcome.
Hi, George. I
Hi.
hope you're okay.
Yes, thank you.
Good stuff. It's devastating to hear about these deaths in the Yemen and in Palestine, and that's not what I was going to talk about, but I just wanted to
It is utterly incredible that 50 children can be slaughtered on a school bus by our best friends. And I mean, admittedly, I'm only listening to a news bulletin every 30 minutes, have not heard a single word from the British government which supplied the weapons that murdered the children.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'm such a wuss with anything to do with children getting any sort of bad treatment that if there's a fictional drama about a kid getting kidnapping, I can't even watch that, for example, whereas I can watch other murder mysteries without any problem. But I was going to go on a lighter note, but it's not really a lighter note. It's about this BBC switch-off tweeting business.
Yeah, how's that going? It seems to be a big thing tonight.
Well, it is, except I've had to come and phone you, my dear, because I seem to have been banned from tweeting. I didn't do that many, honestly. I'm not a very fast typer.
You've been banned. You see, I keep hearing this from people. They've never banned me. Maybe I've just got too many followers. They don't want to take that risk. But I have never been banned.
Off.
But all kinds of people get banned.
Well, exactly. And I just thought, I mean, mind you, I was suspended. Mind you, you were expelled from the Labour Party. So you're always going to go one better than me, aren't you, my dear? Sorry to be flippant.
Not at
but
all.
I just felt a bit isolated because earlier I was thinking, oh, yeah, this is really good. I'd just like to say that, as you know, I only tuned into your show for the first time last Friday, and I've just found it really, really, really uplifting, actually.
Wonderful. Well, it's normally every Friday night. I have been in every night this week, but that won't be at least at the moment, an ongoing thing. But every Friday night, 7 o'clock, the mother of all talk shows. It's a great show. Spread the word, won't you, Georgia? Once you get back on Twitter.
Oh, well, if they let me back, you never know. And as for books, most of mine are quite girly and they show my age. It's What Katie Did and Anne of Green Gables, and then obviously all the Dickens. And my parents, they're Marxist atheists, or they were at the time, and I was showing a sort of communist tendency at the age of about 12. So they suggested I read A Day in the Life of Ivan Ivanovich, if I pronounce that properly.
Ivan Denisovich. Yeah.
That's the one. Thank you. I knew I'd forget it. My son says I've got Alzheimer's disease, and that's not a derogatory remark against anybody that actually does suffer from any mental health illness.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when he wrote that book, was himself a communist who'd been purged in the Stalin period. It's a very harrowing book. I read it as a teenager myself. He later became a wandering obscurantist of indeterminate hue and ended up in very, very dark political places. But it doesn't make the book any less powerful. You're right. Any last one you want to plug?
I can't think of any at the moment. I really can't.
No problem.
But they'll pop up. Anyway, I better shut up because you've got loads of good guests.
I do, and I've got a lot of callers. So I'll bid you good night and thank you for your support on Twitter, and look forward to you joining us every Friday night between 7 and 10 here on Talk Radio. I'm trying to work out what that is. Tell me. The Book of Love, Peter Gabriel. How could I have forgotten it? This is all about books this evening. Bamboleo says, correct about the owners of the world. Globalists, capitalists, they have no religion other than the quest for power. And John Emmett says, George, regarding the current Russia hysteria here and the USA, compare it to the lack of coverage of the Chinese spy that for 20 years worked for Senate Defense Committee member Dianne Feinstein. My goodness, who'd have thunk it? And this is from Milla in London, Islington. Great books, 1984 by George Orwell, A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, Freedom is More Than Just a Seven-Letter Word by Veronica Chapman, The Destruction of a Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, The Art of Seduction and the 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, The Perception Deception by David Icke. Oh, you lost me there. The Autobiography of Malcolm X, How to Coach with NLP by Robbie Steinhaus, The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall, Behold a Pale Horse, to name but a few great books that had huge impact on my evolution. Thank you for that. Melanie Baines says, capitalists worship money. Someone else mentioned the book that had a long-lasting impression on me, Robert Tressel's Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists. Very powerful and very well written. Should be on the national curriculum for 15-plus-year-olds. And The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. The books that influenced me are No Logo, Naomi Klein, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, Perkins, The Rise of the Right, Winlow, Hall and Treadwell, and Adults in the Room by Varoufakis. Quite a highbrow list, that one. The Red Resistance. It seems last night's subject relates to tonight's. The reasons we do nothing about Saudi is the same reason Tom Watson has so much of a war chest, the same reason Americans go bankrupt when ill. Politicians are paid to vote against the will of the people. And Anne Mooney says To Kill a Mockingbird was the first book that affected me and encouraged me to read and question more. Sad how it can still be relevant today after 60 years. Scouser Larma, old pal, says Britain's close relationship with the evil Saudi Arabian regime is a major thing to be ashamed of. And LBR Sutton Coldfield says, talk radio is like music to my ears right now. I just started listening. What a refreshing news channel. I wish I'd known about this a few years ago. I hope the BBC takes notes. Well, it's definitely true that you wouldn't find me on the BBC. Not only presenting a programme, you won't find me on the BBC being interviewed on someone else's programme. How's that? Here is the legend. There is Damien in Brighton. Go ahead, Damien.
Good evening, George.
Evening, sir.
George, this evening I've phoned to express my concerns about the language being used by the media regarding racism and foreign policy.
Colourful language, Humphreys called it.
Well, I find it deeply troubling and highly problematic, George.
Yeah.
Can I offer you 3 examples to explain what I mean by that?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so the first and most recent one is the media's coverage of Boris Johnson's comments about Muslim women, which the media have almost uniformly described as a jibe.
Yes.
Now, I agree with Lord Sheik and Baroness Wolsey on this, seeking to mobilise the racist Tory base for political gain and inciting that racist base, providing it with a target and endangering the safety of Muslim women. That's not a jibe. That is hate speech, which could well lead to attacks on women.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. By the way, Muslim women are already the group in receipt of most hate crime on the streets of Britain. Visibly Muslim women are more likely to be abused, attacked, spat upon, assaulted than any other visible minority.
Attacks on Muslims are at record levels, and a large portion of those attacks are on Muslim women, George, in the last 12 months. A second and broader example is the media's description of a group of right-wing MPs in the Labour Party who they describe as moderates.
Yeah. How moderate do you have to be to support the Iraq war that killed 1 million people? That doesn't sound like anything you could describe as moderate to me.
Well, there's nothing moderate about those right-wing Labour MPs supporting a head-chopping Saudi dictatorship, which is currently responsible for war crimes and a famine in Yemen, which is killing millions of innocent civilians. There is nothing moderate about those right-wing Labour MPs supporting an apartheid state, which has an army that it deploys snipers to shoot women, men and children in the head. So for me, George, describing those people as moderates is completely inaccurate. It would be more accurate, I would argue, to describe them as extremist, war crime, apartheid apologists, perhaps.
Yeah.
Now, the third example, George, is the media's coverage of Israel 3 weeks ago passing apartheid legislation in the Knesset.
Yeah.
Now, again...
By the way, I should add,
yes,
that's exactly how it was described by Daniel Barenboim, by the Haaretz newspaper, the principal newspaper in Israel, by hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens themselves. It is explicitly an apartheid law.
It is. That is exactly what it is, George. And yet our media uniformly described it as controversial. There's nothing controversial about apartheid, George. It's unacceptable. South African apartheid was unacceptable, and Israeli apartheid was unacceptable. Now, the conclusion I'm drawing from this language that the media is using, George, is that language is highly problematic. I would suggest that the use of describing apartheid as controversial is apartheid apology, if not verging on apartheid propaganda. And I think that the language they're using begs the question. And the question is our British media institutionally racist? And do you think that is a reasonable question to pose?
I don't know about institutionally. They'd probably fall off their chairs at the very idea, but they very definitely have a blind spot about Palestinians and about Muslims, and the kind of talk that I heard this day from civilized liberal people about Muslims would never, ever cross their lips about anybody else. Islamophobia is the last respectable form of racism, and it is a wonder to behold when you see the support that Boris Johnson has garnered as a result of his, quote, colourful language, according to John Humphreys on BBC Radio 4 this morning, from suburban liberals, metropolitan liberals, as well as the Robinson lumpen crew. It's quite frightening, actually, to me, Damien.
So, George, could we agree on saying that there is a streak of racism running through the British media?
Yes, a big, broad streak, yes. Okay. Certainly when it comes to Palestinians, Arabs and Muslims, certainly. And in a way that they would never talk about African women's dress. They would never talk about Jewish women's dress, Catholic women's dress, in the way they talk about Muslim women's dress. They would never dream of it. And you'd be banished from their dinner party tables if you did. Pleasure, Damien. As always, thanks for joining us. Let's take a break. Wuthering Heights. They're swaying behind the glass to Kate Bush. Well, I was indignant in the extreme at the beginning of the show about the gigantic war crime that Saudi Arabia carried out today using our weapons and guided by our experts on a school bus, which killed up to 50 Yemeni children, on top of the tens of thousands of Yemenis, men, women and children, who have been massacred in this attack by the richest country in the Middle East against the poorest country in the Middle East, on which, of course, we have pinned our own colours. But I also referenced the crime that was carried out against the people in what David Cameron described as the largest open-air prison in the world, namely the Gaza Strip. My next guest is from there, and he's been my friend for 40 years. He is the doyen of Arab journalists. He is the prince of Arab letters. He's Abdul Bari Atwan, and I welcome him to the show. Abdul Bari, thanks.
My pleasure, George.
Now, let's talk about Yemen first. For how long and how many of these atrocities will people permit to go on in Yemen without demanding that we dissociate ourselves in this country from those crimes, at the very least, in your view?
George, I'm honestly ashamed, for the reaction of the Western world in particular, the free world, as they call themselves, their reaction to these massacres after massacres which are taking place against the poorest or one of the poorest people on earth. They bombed wedding celebrations. They bombed actually condolences councils or meetings. They bombed schools. They bombed hospitals. People are starving. Staff never been paid for the last 20 months by the richest country or countries in the world. And despite of that, the Western world is completely silent and actually collaborating with this kind of bombing which is taking place. For example, yesterday, as you mentioned in your introduction, 60 people were massacred, most of them children, and more than 100 people were injured. And the Saudi spokesman, or the so-called coalition, which is fighting in Yemen, the spokesman, he said that those people actually were responsible for firing Scud missiles or ballistic missiles against Saudi Arabia. So
the children on a bus were responsible for firing missiles.
Honestly, I'm quoting him. His name is Mr. Maliki, and he's a colonel on the Saudi army. He said, we bombed people who were responsible for launching ballistic missiles against Jazan in Saudi Arabia. Imagine children, school children, but is, a base of launching missiles against Saudi Arabia. So it is ridiculous. And about just a week ago, there was a similar massacre took place in Hodeidah. This is the largest port in Yemen. And so, I don't know, I haven't had a single condemnation of this kind of attacks against, those poor or the poorest people or the poorest children in our earth. The Red Cross said it was a massacre. They said, they were children and a school bus. And what's the reaction? George.
Well, I'm just as ashamed as you as to the Western silence on this crime. But tell me why the Arabs are silent. Some Arab states are involved in this crime. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, who certainly for foreign policy purposes have become the same country. Their crown princes hand in hand in every crime that is committed. But where are the Arabs, as we have frequently said, you and I, over decades in another theatre, in the theatre of the Palestinian issue? What do the Arabs say about the richest Arabs massacring the poorest Arabs?
Yes, George, I'm glad you asked me this question. If Saudi Arabia managed to buy, the greatest superpower in our earth, the United States, and silence its president, Donald Trump, if they managed to bribe him, to bribe his country with about $500 billion, so what do you expect from other corrupt Arab governments or Arab countries? This is what is happening. The problem is in the head of, the rotten in the head of the fish, not actually the tail of the fish. Those people, they have no authorities at all. They were bought by the Saudis. They are scared by the Saudis. Look at what the Saudis are doing to Canada, for example, and because the Prime Minister Trudeau, supported or was sympathetic to a few women who, activists, human rights activists, who were arrested by the Saudi government. They have frozen all trade with Canada.
And they threatened Canada. Let's put the cards on the table. They issued a thinly veiled threat against Canada.
Yes. They are blackmailing Canada. They withdrew 15,000 Saudi students who were studying in Canada. Even the sick people who are treated in Canada, they were withdrawn. All trade with Canada was frozen completely. So imagine that they are losing their financial muscles to humiliate a country like Canada. Who supported Canada? Who sympathized with Canada? Did Britain sympathize with Canada? Did the United States sympathize with Canada? Did Germany sympathize with Canada? So this is the problem we are facing. Instead of standing by Canada, I disagree with Canada. Canada never actually condemned the Israeli massacres on Gaza and other parts of Palestine or in Lebanon. But despite that, I do support them because they said the truth when it comes to human rights. And they said we will stand by those activists who are trying to actually rectify the situation and their oppressed, to the favor of their oppressed people. That's what happened.
Now, we both know that there are very many fine people in Saudi Arabia. Our condemnation is of their regime. A significant number of Saudi citizens are of Yemeni origin. Are there any signs of disquiet or even being so repulsed by what's happening to their ancestral homeland that the Saudi regime could get into local difficulties?
George, if you tweet on your Twitter account, one tweet, just a neutral, criticizing Saudi Arabia or objecting for certain sides of the internal policies of the Saudi Arabia, you will be sent to the prison for 15 years. So how do you expect Yemeni expats actually to raise their voice? They will be arrested and they will be actually, if they are lucky, if they are deported. so they wouldn't have, any jobs. They wouldn't have any income, and their families will suffer. And the same thing to the Saudi people. Salman al-Auda, he is a Saudi preacher. He is in jail now without any trial, simply because he stayed neutral in the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which is a member of Gulf Cooperation Council. So imagine that if a Yemeni who is a stranger, who is a foreigner, criticizes the Saudi, what will happen to him? I think this is the situation. And as I said, the West is major interest is to sell arms to the Saudis in order to kill the Yemeni people. This is the problem. A war for the last 4 years, and many people are really suffering from this. And many people were killed. Many people were injured. No hospitals, no money, starvation, cholera, you name it. And despite that, for 4 years, the West, who is championing the human rights, completely silent, including our country, Britain here, with the country which we are living in. They never said a word against the Saudi. They never said enough is enough. You are massacring innocent people. This is the story.
Now, finally, last night, I don't know how many were killed in the Israeli strikes against Gaza, but I do know that a pregnant young mother and her 14-month-old daughter were killed. Has that made any impact on Arab public opinion, or are they watching both the Yemenis and the Palestinians being crucified silently?
George, I am from Gaza. Incidentally, I was born in Deir al-Balah, where this massacre took place, where this young lady, 23 years of age, and her daughter, and her, she was pregnant, she was killed. I know the family. I don't know those people who were martyred, but I know the place. I know that this family. I was really shocked personally. The Israeli actually bombed them without any reason, because they bombed them while Hamas is talking for a truce, which could last for 10 years. Well, they will stop all kinds of violence against the Israelis. So imagine that when the political bureau of Hamas meeting or convening in Gaza in order to approve this truce and to send their approval to Egypt, the mediator, the Israelis sent the F-15 and F-16 to bomb Gaza. George, Gaza is 150 square miles only, and you know it very well. So despite that, the Israelis are bombing it. And people are starving. Honestly, people are starving. And I found them between now and then. People they go to the dustbin, they go to, rubbish bin in order to eat in Gaza. And the sanction is killing people. No electricity, no water, no hospitals, nothing at all. And despite that, the Israelis are sending their F-16 to bomb those people. So imagine, and the international community is silent. Some of the Arab governments who are pro-American are completely silent. And the same thing also taking place on this country. The same thing. They are busy with anti-Semitism, and they are not busy with the work and massacres of people who are protecting or defending anti-Semitism or shaming anybody who is saying a single word of criticism against the Israelis.
Abdul Bari Atwan, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Simon says, isn't that a rhyme? Simon says, can't take much more of this stirrer and angry snowflake, Galloway. The mummy of all talk shows is only suitable for one show a week. Galloway should be on LBC. And as for asking for listeners last night, ... It's not your slot! ! It's a pity he didn't text it, then it would have at least cost him money. Lubna says, on book day, I remember the great author, Dr. Edward Said, R.I.P. His book, Orientalism. Yep, indispensable, Lubna. And Mike says, Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky is arguably the most important book I've ever read. It's especially important now as our media is hoodwinking us down the road to fascism. And Jed, a Manchester United fan, says, George, one of the greatest books I've read and a book that would help a lot of people is How to Win Friends and Influence People. Thanks for that, Jed. And Chris says, the blatant hypocrisy of the West is breathtaking, yet Russia is constantly painted as the devil. I fear we are now inevitably heading towards World War III. And Simon in Droitwich says, books, any of those in which the mighty Charles Dickens hits out at social injustice. He was a true champion of the poor. Simon's back. And as for the overinflated ego, Mr. G, the fact that you're on for only an hour a week speaks enough volume for me. And I'm not talking about your constant shouting at us. #angryjock. Well, thanks for listening, Simon. And it's 3 hours a week, by the way. I'll be back with the final hour quite shortly. So get your fingers on the dial. 0344 499 1000. Let's hear from Anthea in Essex. Always a pleasure. Go ahead, Anthea.
Oh, hello, George.
Hi.
Now, be kind, because we're going to have a teeny tiny quarrel.
Okay, go on.
But it's only a teeny tiny one, all right? Don't cut me out of your will.
No.
I want my hands on your millions. What it is, I've heard a lot of people, and it wouldn't just be you, say that Israel is an apartheid state.
Mm-hmm.
And my quarrel with it is that both you and I are old and hoary-haired enough to remember apartheid. And they're not quite the same because they're not built on quite the same foundation. And one of the things I think is quite important to help, particularly our youth coming up, is to understand the unique dynamics of a unique time in history. So, for example, 6 million black people died in the Middle Passage and the years of slavery in the centuries past, but we don't call it a Holocaust because people call it the Middle Passage or they call it Marfa because it's a different experience. The numbers are the same as the Holocaust. 6 million Jews died, but it's not quite the same because it's not built on the same foundation. It's not quite the same unique alchemy or combination of events that created that evil, and it's a unique evil. And I think it was really helpful for me as a mother raising my children to help them know that something that happened in its own particular way. And although they're all perhaps arenas in which evil can thrive, they're individual and unique events in history. Do you know what I mean? And I get a bit worried when I hear people saying glibly that Israel is an apartheid state. I think, no, apartheid was very different. And the same way as the Holocaust was very different and the Middle Passage / Marfa was very different. Do you know what I mean, George?
No, and it's not a tiny disagreement at all. I prefer the words of Nelson Mandela and more recently the words of his grandson who was there in Palestine seeing it, in which both of them said that apartheid in Israel-Palestine is worse than it was in South Africa. Apartheid means separate development. That's the meaning of the Afrikaner's word, separate development, separating race and nation. And the new nation law of Israel, passed just a few weeks ago, has been described by Haaretz, the finest of all Israeli newspapers, by Daniel Barenboim, the greatest of all living Israelis, the great musician, conductor, pianist, gigantic cultural figure, explicitly as apartheid, because the new national law separates people on a racial basis. It says this town, this village is only for Jews. That, I'm afraid, Anthea, is apartheid.
Well, the reason why I said that was not because necessarily people don't end up in a similar situation, but because of, I suppose, it being built upon a different historical and philosophical foundation.
No,
and it may seem pettifogging to you.
Well,
but
it's worse than pettifogging, and neither is it a teeny disagreement. I'm telling you what Mandela said. Does he know more about apartheid than you?
I think what it is for me, and of course everybody's going to see things differently. I'm looking back over my life as I'm getting older, and I'm saying to myself, that apartheid was built upon 2 centuries of scientific racism and colonialism that's very slightly, that's, for me, is different in scope. However, the reason why I call it a teeny tiny disagreement is not because these things don't matter, but because we can still say something is wrong, but just say that we feel it's got a different genesis.
No. I think it's entirely the same genesis. It is ethno-religious supremacy. And that's what Mandela said. And I stand with Mandela. Anthea, thanks for your call. Henry Hogg says, let's make it a regular thing. Bin the beeb at 6, they'll collapse or change. My bet they'll do the latter, but we must do something. Doing nothing is not an option. Bin the beeb at 6. As you mentioned, says this is 4FNNTM04U. My goodness, what a handle. As you mentioned, the Scottish referendum debate just now, during a TV debate with Jim Sillars in 2014, you were quite clear that you would be campaigning to remain in the EU and that anyone with any brain cells would also be doing. I'm not sure that that's accurate in any respect. Eddie in Islington, N1, says, George, why don't the media mention that all Arabs, including the Palestinians, are Semitic and rogue states? Where's Bush now? Has he mentioned the murderous regimes of Saudi Arabia, Israel and others? Great show, George. Eddie in Islington. Thanks, Eddie. Wayne says, just can't help but recommend The Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway. He may have been a misogynist drunkard, but could he write a novel or what? Nobel Prize for Literature, no less, and in fewer than 100 pages. Gripping, yet so simple. Genius. And Christopher Tomina says, your faithful listener from San Diego loves Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh and the brothers Karamazov, Fyodor Dostoevsky. FVNK says, I don't think that was a very fair quip at David Icke like that. He's been right about a lot of stuff. Forget about the lizard claptrap. Ah, yes. Fornicate with one sheep, and you'll be called a sheep fornicator for the rest of your life. Describe the British royal family as shape-shifting lizards. Describe the Duke of Edinburgh as the head of a world conspiracy who turns literally into a lizard at night. Describe yourself as the son of God. And hey, you'll be called a crank forever, won't you? Peter in Wigan is on the line. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, hi, George.
Hi, mate.
Can I just inject a bit of light entertainment into your show?
Yes.
Well, I'm a great fan of your show, and I don't like to miss it. It's the only breath of fresh air that I get, at the age of 70.
Oh, Peter, that's young.
Apart from opening the window occasionally. But it's, in terms of the media, it's the only breath of fresh air, and I hate to miss your shows. So you can imagine my consternation when I switched my computer on this morning to find that it had a heart attack. And I've been racing round all day.
Oh, my goodness.
Finally, because I didn't want to miss your show, and I couldn't find out how to get on through the radio. I couldn't find the wavelength. And perhaps you can tell us that later.
There's no wavelength. It's digital radio, and that's one of our problems. A lot of people don't know that we exist because we're not on a wavelength. We're not even on the Sky television package. I've never understood why.
No, well, I'm on Virgin, and I couldn't find it on there. Anyway, you can imagine the lengths I've gone to get on your show or to
Well, it's very good that you made the effort, Peter. Thank you very much for that.
I've actually been out. I've bought a new computer. I've got it up and running.
My goodness, that is going beyond duty. Yeah, terrific, Peter. Thanks.
So that was just a personal story.
All right, thanks.
On the issue of this is the Yemeni thing.
Yes.
Which, as you probably... If you recall some of our earlier conversations, I feel very sensitive about what's going on in Palestine, in Gaza, in Syria, and in Yemen. And I lived for 12 years in the United Arab Emirates. And I don't want to say a lot about it, but until
Which part,
1990,
if I may say? Which part?
I lived in quite a few places. I was for the most part in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
I was in Dubai.
I always liked Abu Dhabi, I must say. When the late Sheikh Zayed was in charge, I had a good personal relationship with him. And I visited Abu Dhabi many times.
I'm going to follow on from that in a second. And I worked for a Lebanese, what shall we say, entrepreneur who was a very tough guy, but he was also a great guy. And he had contacts with the Abu Dhabi royal family. But I lived in Abu Dhabi, I lived in Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, and that's all the places I lived in. But I was there for 12 years, and I heard a caller the other night. I'll just throw this in very quick. And he said he was terrified of getting on the bus.
Scared the life out of him, he said.
Well, I had 12 years of that, George, and the only terrifying moment I had was when 4 of these girls wearing the niqab, but it was the Abu Dhabi, it was the UAE version, which you probably remember is like a little thin mask, and they had the full version and they had the sexy version, so you could actually see most of their face anyway. And they surrounded my car and they wouldn't let me get in, and they were really laughing and giggling, and I thought, wow, anyway, that's another story.
Well, yeah, maybe for later in the evening, Peter, rather than at 9:14.
But there was
the sexy version of the niqab.
There was nothing scary about them, I can say that.
No.
But the point I wanted to make was that Sheikh Zayed was, even though he was a sort of paternal...
Sure, he was an autocrat, yes.
Autocrat, yes. And the same with Sheikh Rashid in Dubai. They would be turning in their graves if they could see what their spoilt brat sons were doing in Yemen. Because in the 12 years I was there, they did nothing but promote peace and harmony and well-being, and to further the causes of the Palestinians and of the people in that region. And to see what's going on now, and they blame it all on the Saudis. Of course, it's not just the Saudis.
No.
The Emirates,
UAE is up to its neck in it all, yes.
I'm horrified.
Yes.
And to the point where I've made comments, and I don't think I'd be allowed to go back into that country now.
You and me both, Peter, you and me both.
Yeah.
I was a regular. I'm still wearing a watch given to me by Sheikh Zayed. God rest his soul. He was a wise leader. He knew that the outside powers wanted the Arabs to be divided and fighting with each other, the better to exploit the resources of the Arab world. And I'm afraid that today's rulers in the UAE have completely lost that message.
They're not fit to lick his boots.
Peter in Wigan, that's you and me both on the banned list for the UAE. Thanks for the call. Urban Gorilla says, as we all know, shame is not a consideration when big money is involved. Sad, but true. And an SMS from Mark in Lowestoft. Evening, Gigi. This will explain why I have absolutely no time for the deceptive omitting MSM while loving your show. Tell Me No Lies by the one and only John Pilger, dedicated to the memory of the late Paul Foote, whose work is also included in this book, alongside work by Seymour Hersh, Seamus Milne and Robert Fisk, real investigative journalists, honourable men and a credit to their profession, unlike the spineless cowards we have in the mainstream media these days. All the best, GG, from Mark in Lowestoft. And hear to that. Richard Red Star says, I just heard Damien's comments on Talk Radio. Spot on with all the points you made. I must say Damien is a star. I encouraged him on air live, you remember, to get on Twitter. He's now one of the big stars on Twitter. Please follow Damien from Brighton. Hell's Bell says, had you followed the narrative of the moderates with your great oratory skills, you would now be the most cherished and most highly paid lovey of the BBC. Yes. Luckily, I've got a wife who would never remind me of such a thing. She'd rather I kept my principles and that we had to count every penny. David Leviscont says ISIS, Daesh were created by the West, probably with the intention to incite hatred towards Muslims. The world seems to do Israel and Wahhabism's dirty work. What is the point in encouraging hatred towards Muslims? Didn't we witness something similar in the 1930s? Bob Justice says, Saida Varsi is the only Tory I currently have any respect for. I've seen no acting as she tours TV studios being rounded on and repeatedly asked for evidence of Tory party behaviour. When it comes to Labour, evidence seems secondary to the outrage klaxon. Bob Justice got away with words, I must say. Now, Nicole Russin McFarlane, wonderful name, hyphenated, wonderful name, Nicole Russin McFarland, is a writer, a producer, an actress, and an author in the United States. I want to talk to her about Book Lovers Day, about American politics, and about the politics of Hollywood, right after this. David Bowie, singing about 1984, which we thought was a novel, but turned out to be a manual, a training manual for how we'd end up not many years after 1984. My missus has just left the studio. I've sent her down the market to get one of the sexy version of the niqab that Peter was talking about. As he described it, I found myself more and more drawn to it. Now, Nicole Russin McFarland, as I said, is a writer, a producer, an actress, and an author in the United States. So who better to talk about on World Book Lovers Day? Nicole, thanks very much for joining us.
I'm very pleased you can pronounce my last name. In America, nobody can say my name.
Well,
it's amazing.
I come from the Scottish-Irish tradition which McFarlane...
It's Northern Irish last name. The second last name is Northern Irish, so I'm glad you...
Fantastic.
You nailed it.
Yeah. Nicole, you are an author. Tell us the kind of books you write, first of all.
Well, I also publish books, but primarily for me, I write children's readers, which are basically the first chapter books that you read when you are 8 years old, 7 years old, very Roald Dahl type stuff. So I have one that people really like because it's not your standard cheesy book, and it's called The Big Bad Wolf Strikes It Rich. And I eventually want to make it a cartoon. I somehow either animate myself or direct and then other people animate it. But it's a very kind of people compare it a lot to the Donald Trump book, The Art of the Deal, I believe it's called, and they see the humor in it, and I'm glad because it's supposed to be this kind of like if he were a real business person, but he's a wolf. He's the big bad wolf, and it has so much of real New York experiences in the book. Like at one point I poke fun at it and I say, today was a fairy tale because I saw these giant sewer rats taking over Manhattan. Oh, wait, that's just normal New York. And, it's just very silly, but it's also very truthful and teaches kids about money.
The Big Bad Wolf Strikes It Rich sounds a very Hollywood kind of story.
Yeah.
You know a good deal about Holyrood. Let me ask you something that I learned at the weekend. A good friend of mine, Mark Miller, is quite big in Hollywood these days. He was the man that brought many of the Marvel comics to the screen, and he's now the head of Netflix in Britain. And he was telling me a staggering statistic that 2 out of every $3 invested in film in Hollywood nowadays is either Chinese or Russian. Is that going to make a big difference, do you think, to the kind of output?
Well, with censorship, yeah, because I saw that there was a recent film, and I don't remember what it was, but they censored it in China. I would have to reread it. I want to say it was Peter Rabbit. I can't be sure. And then also with Russia,
they should have censored that. They shouldn't have shown it. I thought it was a dreadful movie.
Bad?
It was a dreadful film. Yes.
I haven't seen it. I was kind of curious
you won't
about
be
it.
seeing presumably Chinese and Russian people painted automatically as the bad guys if 2 out of every $3 invested in the movies are Chinese.
No, but
and
you know
Russian.
something interesting? In North Korea, it's the reverse. So when they remake our movies, our Western movies, they remake them portraying Americans and British as the bad people.
That sounds a bit
and
more
they have
accurate.
Their own stories.
That sounds a bit more accurate to
Yeah.
me. Now, look, Christopher Robin, by the way, was the film, not Peter Rabbit. So we should withdraw our traducing of
I
of
couldn't
Peter,
remember.
of Peter Rabbit. Now, it is World Book Lovers Day. What books got you started in life? I don't mean your childhood books necessarily, but as you were growing up, becoming a teenager, beginning to learn about the world, what were the books that stay with you now as having been important in your development?
Well, ironically, they're not the longest. I liked The Time Machine and I liked The Diary of Anne Frank.
Well,
Those are some of my
H.G.
favorites.
Wells is a very a big favorite of mine. He was, of course, an English socialist living in Bloomsbury, not too far from here. And his Time Machine was very prescient, very much ahead of the times.
And the remakes are never really...
Never the same, no.
No, there have been two different movies, and they're just neither one is very, or I guess I should say, since this is a UK show, neither, because I speak Chicagoan. Neither one is either very good, and the acting is very good. Guy Pearce is excellent, but I just didn't think it drew the spirit of the book, and they completely changed it. That's the other thing, and I think if I could ever one day be lucky enough to get my hands on it and have something like DreamWorks Animation help me with the budget and all of that, I would love to really.
Well, I know they're listening. I know they're listening, Nicole. So maybe we'll get somewhere on that. Now, you mentioned you mentioned the Diaries of Anne Frank. My wife comes from Amsterdam, literally 50 yards from Anne Frank House, and I was recently around it, and it's a very, very powerful experience. I must say, the family hiding upstairs. In the attic as the pogrom began to take place. Took place actually before the Gestapo arrived there. Dutch fascists and anti-Semites were the first to fall upon their own Jews and start putting them onto trains to the east and to the concentration camps and their eventual immolation. And the Frank family were holed up in this attic, and of course were betrayed, and no one knows quite whom, though when you go around the house you're not left in much doubt about who or what kind of people betrayed them. Anyone who's read Anne Frank's diaries could not fail to be moved, and reading them at a young age is particularly character forming, I would have thought.
In the beginning of the book, and I have a copy of the book that I read every year, kind of around wintertime, just to kind of remind myself, don't be so snobbish. This could be you. Because in the beginning of the book, when she was younger, and you start when I would say she was about, I could be wrong, but 14, I want to say, she sounds like any young person I would have known at school. And she's very sarcastic and making fun of classmates. And it sounds like it could be taking place now. It doesn't sound, and she was very much into movie stars. When Justin Bieber went to go
in the
sign
house,
her book.
in the house, the pictures of our matinee idols are still there in the house.
People made fun of when Justin Bieber went to her house and he said she would have been a fan of his. But actually, it's correct, because she would have been a fan of his immediately. Like, I feel like I know that girl just from reading her diary. She was big on pops, who I guess would have been pop stars of her time and movie stars and pop culture.
Yep, absolutely. Now, finally, because of the lateness of the hour, and I'm grateful for your time, are you a big Donald Trump fan, Nicole?
Well, I guess I should tell you the truth on this. I have a different perspective on him just because of, and actually on Obama as well, because I kind of was familiar with them before they became politicians. So with Barack Obama, my friend's dad was a politician in Illinois. As some of you may know, Barack Obama was a state senator in Illinois. Mm-hmm. And when he was freshly elected, my friend's dad was in leadership in the state house. So I got to meet Obama before he was famous, before he was a U.S. senator or anything. And I was actually going to interview him before he became mega famous. The week I was supposed to interview him, I think they blew me off, so to speak, for the U.S. Senate campaign, because he became famous at the convention and gave this big speech.
Yep.
So I had seen him around. And then Donald Trump, I was actually going to work with his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And this is not me speaking politically. This is just me speaking of him as a person. In my life, I have met many, many famous people, many people who go on to be famous, and people, and you would know so well because you've been in Parliament, that many people have two faces. And there's a face for the public and a face for, I guess the people who get autographs, that sort of thing, and then who they really are. And of the people I have met in my lifetime in terms of, and I will explain in a minute why I didn't work with him, but of the people I've met in terms of finding work, in any profession, he has been one of the only people to treat me like a lady and to treat me so respectfully. At the time, we were both much younger, and he owned a newspaper called The Observer. And the only reason I did not work with him was because there was another gentleman who was going to, it was a special project of The Observer related to politics. And I was kind of basically leaving college, and I was going to report some things from out of state for this special website The Observer was putting up. And it was a money issue. Basically, his partner on the website didn't care what Jared said. He didn't want to pay me what Jared had said and things like that. But I mean, Mr. Kushner was a total gentleman. Now, is he still that person? I would like to think so. I don't doubt that he is, at least half of him, still a lovely man. I don't doubt that. I think your actions speak louder than words in many cases. And there are many people who you meet them in real life. And as an example, I so badly want to say this man's name. I cannot say his name. But there is a well-known journalist I was dining with one day in New York when I was, I want to say like 21, 22. And he introduced me to a well-known kind of a Steve Jobs type, but it's not Steve Jobs, but it's that type of person. And that man gave me a cold, clammy handshake, didn't talk to me one word. And he acted like I was the most inappropriate, disgusting person of the century, all while I would meet people on a regular basis. And I met him because he was leaving a prominent TV program, and I was, talking to this journalist and eating, and he was also going to, I think, interview him for something. And so I was talking to him, and he acted like I was dead. And then all the while, this guy's a role model to people. So that's why I talk about the two faces, that there are many people.
Well, look, because of the hour, I'm going to offer you not a cold, clammy handshake, but a warm, friendly one. And thank you for your insights, not the kind of insight we normally do get here. I don't know the people that you're talking about, but they sound like, I don't know, the people that were taking over the streets earlier in your story, maybe. Lizzie says, I must always have been an escapist, as Tolkien, Terry Pratchett, Anne McCaffrey and Stephen Donaldson were my first serious reading loves. Wizards and hobbits, living in Discworld, visiting the dragons of Pern, and stepping through the mirror is great. Well, Lizzie. And Mr. John Hodgkins says, George, another book, Losing Israel by Jasmine Donaghy. Brought up as a Jew, surrounded by stories of heroism relating to the founding of Israel, she comes to appreciate the monstrous injustice done to the Palestinian people. Going by the book, the great Johnny Cash. How wonderful. The wife's just flitted in with that sexy version of the niqab. She bought it down the market. I can see right through it. And boy, does she look beautiful. Let's take some more of the messages. Joe Guardiola says the ragged-trousered philanthropists and marks for beginners really made an impression on me at age 17. I was living in the Crumlin Road. Well, I've read both, Joe, probably around about the same age. Terry Eaton says, at 16 I read The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist, which pushed me to trade unionism. I would advocate this book and all Dickens novels to secondary school pupils. And Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings was inspiring. And Tony X, the protest board, says, without doubt the book which shaped my mind the most as a child was The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. Original title, Les Damnes de la Terre. A truly magnificent book. Every sentence and chapter carves itself into your heart, mind and soul. Beautifully written, Tony. And here is from an unknown texter, from Simon the Dickens, I beg your pardon, Simon. From Simon the Dickens fan in Droitwich. Hi again, George. Just wanted to make it clear, I'm not the angry Simon whose message you read before mine. Well, he's simple, Simon. You're clever, Simon. Thank you very much indeed. And Chris says, I'm starting to think many liberals must be blind. While demonizing Russia and Iran, they strangely seem to ignore the bombs dropped by Saudi and Israel. And Marie says, the letterbox racist joke has been around amongst NFB, NP and the like for at least 20 years that I know of in the street and on social media. Johnson's vile comment was the taper that lit a global bonfire. Actually, the bank robber jibe was the worst of the two jibes, as they're now being called, or colourful language, because, of course, the real bank robbers wear suits and shirts and ties. Here's David in Stirling, always worth hearing. David, go ahead.
Hi, George.
Hi.
How are you doing again?
Yes, good, sir.
I was wanting to put a fact out about NTV this week, George, in the morning, which is very, very biased. It's quite good when Piers Morgan's on it.
Oh, yes.
At least he gives a bit of an argument.
Is this the Good Morning Britain, you mean, on ITV? Yeah.
Sorry, that's the one. GMT, yeah.
Yeah.
GMT. What they were saying was they had the Tony Benn's, I think it was his niece or grandkid that was on the phone, on the panel.
Yeah.
And she's been in the capital industry, she's been in banking and all the rest. And her and Hillary Benn, Tony Benn, turning their graves the way they were talking about the Brexit situation. It was unbelievably biased. There was no one there to defend Jeremy Corbyn. No one. And then they brought in, because they were mentioning about what Boris Johnson had said. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Boris Johnson had said about the letterbox situation.
Yeah, what did they have to say about that?
Well, they were trying to kid on that it wasn't very nice, but they weren't giving them as tight as they were giving.
Not giving them as hardest time as they'd given Jeremy Corbyn.
I mean, I was actually disgusted when I seen it, John. I was just going to my work.
Well, as you know, David, Mr. Benn was very dear to me and for 40 years. And so I've taken the self-denying ordinance of not responding to the kind of things that is now being said, not just by his son, Hillary, but by his granddaughter, Emily. Thanks a lot, though, for the call. This is from Lubna. The West has succeeded in numbing its citizens via media. The citizen thinks, work or revolt. Work brings food to the table. No point in revolting. No change because of fear. And Mark in Darlaston says, fantastic show, George. Keep up the good work. Thanks for that, Mark. Let Simple Simon know, won't you? George, been listening intently all week, as always, and what a week it's been so far. I feel at this stage now that the Labour Friends of Israel have used their wild card. They are now running out of options, and I have a strong feeling that the fight will be taken out of their hands and carried on by much darker elements who are lurking in the background, and this worries me. I pray for Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, yourself, and all who are taking them on every day. Stay safe. Thank you very much indeed for that. That's from Tommy in County Tyrone. And Milla in Islington. George, I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the document, The Protocols of Zion? I read a vast portion of this long document online a few years back, and it strikes me as eerie and chilling that what was written and planned many years ago in this document for humanity by its authors seems to be being played out step by step in real time across the globe now. I ask because I rate and respect your knowledge and opinion highly. If you do, Milla, please take careful note of what I'm about to say. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a forgery. It has been unmasked and debunked as a forgery 100 years ago. 100 years ago. It is a vile, anti-Semitic tract. It is poison of the darkest, most pernicious kind. And I urge you, please, if you do respect me, to erase it from your mind and never raise it with me again. Richard Jenkins says, do the right-wingers in the Labour Party even reflect on the ongoing and current blowing up of children in Palestine and Yemen? There's just no comment from them anywhere. It's infuriating that they occupy our party. Love the mother of all talk shows, says Richard Jenkins. I haven't seen Emily Thornberry's response yet, or I haven't read it rather, but I know that it's out there. So Labour have responded. I'm still waiting for Theresa May.
Goldfinger, he's the man with the mind.
See, I think that's the best of the Bond themes. And Shirley Bassey, the best of the Bond theme singers. Better than Adele, don't you think? The great Shirley Bassey. Goldfinger. The name's Bond. James Bond. Ryan in Eastbourne is on the line. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Ryan.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, I'd like to just mention the double standards of the media in that Boris Johnson can say these comments in the Telegraph about burqa, making inflammatory statements about a religious garment that many Muslim women choose to wear. Whereas if a Labour politician went and said something about traditional Jewish garment, they'd be the first to ring out saying that person's anti-Semitic, and by extension, Jeremy Corbyn is also anti-Semitic, and he needs to resign.
Yes, it is extraordinary, the double standard. And even a blind man could see it. Even someone with a niqab all the way up to their eyebrows could see it. And it's willful. You know, our journalists are not stupid people. They're all university graduates, some of them at the very finest universities. These are not mistakes they're making. Neither did Boris Johnson make a mistake. He weighed very carefully, I believe, after discussing it with Steve Bannon, the dog whistler from the Trump campaign, and he did it deliberately, and he believes, and he might be right, that it will propel him into power. I made the point to a person I interviewed earlier today for my television show that, well, surely it puts him out of the running for the Tory leadership because most Conservative members of Parliament will not want to be associated with that kind of racism. And the interviewee laughed, and when I thought about it later, he was probably right to laugh, because at the end of the day, they think that what Johnson did is popular amongst, not just amongst the voters, but amongst those most likely to vote. And the only thing the Tory MPs who will be doing the nominating care about is whether or not they can win the next election. So it might be that far from the Dardanelles level blunder I thought it was by the Pound Shop Churchill Tribute Act, it may have turned out to be a master stroke, Ryan.
Well, if you saw there was a Sky News poll finding that 59% of the public was in favour of banning the burqa, which quite shocked me and made me pretty ashamed of some of my country that we hold such bigoted views.
You and me both, son. Thanks for the call. Charlie is in Glasgow. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Charlie.
Hiya, George.
Hi, sir.
Hiya. It's just a quick call. I mean, the terrible news from the Yemen, where there is 50 school children murdered in a bus, it's just terrible. Mm-hmm. Terrible news, man.
I'm not sure I've heard of a worse atrocity individually in one strike. Yeah. I'm not sure I can remember a worse one, actually.
No, it's just, I mean, words fail me. You know, yeah.
Well, the words have definitely failed Theresa May and the Foreign Secretary, whoever is the Foreign Secretary now, I've momentarily forgotten. But neither of them has said a cheep so far.
Yeah, I know. And as you pointed out, you know, we're arming the people that are doing these things.
Not just arming. We're in the targeting. We have officers in the command and control centre that's running the war.
Yeah.
Just think about that.
Yeah, but I mean, there's even I've sort of read online, you know, that there's allegations that the American military is apparently supporting the Al Qaeda in the Yemen as well. Have you seen anything about that at all?
Oh, there's without a doubt, as they were supporting Al Qaeda and even ISIS in Syria, and so were we. Both the United States and Britain were giving weapons and material to fuel the insurgency of ISIS and Al Qaeda and the rest of the associated fanatic organizations in Syria for years. So the fact that they're doing it in Yemen is absolutely no surprise. It's a continuation of the policy that they have been following in the region now for years.
what is the rationale behind that, George? If fair rationale is the right word, you know?
Yeah, well, rationale would be stretching it, but their logic is my enemy's enemy is my friend. And that's why they did the very same thing throughout the 1980s in Afghanistan, when they armed and financed and propagandized for the Islamist fanatics that were fighting the government in Kabul in the so-called Mujahideen period. If you look at Rocky 5, I think it is, at the end of the film, Sylvester Stallone dedicates the film to the so-called Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And as I always used to say, Charlie, to David Cameron's face in the House of Commons, have you read Frankenstein? And if you did read it, did you read it to the end? Did you read it to the end when the monster that you created actually broke free and proved that it was a monster and ate you? And he never had an answer to that. I asked him more than once in Parliament. Charlie, I've got to press on, pal. Do you mind come back tomorrow night, if you would? I'm here again, God willing, at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. It's just I've got such a huge number of messages I want to get through, some of them in the remaining 5 minutes. Thanks for the call, Charlie. Scouser Lar says, I wish talk radio would give you a slot every night, George. Moats as a bastion of fantastic debate and education. Well, I wish so too, Scouser Lar. But it's up to them, of course. If the money's right, I'm available. Chris says, Liberals must be blind. No, we've done that one. Tony says, I believe the status of Israel is an apartheid state, and this wall-to-wall anti-Semitism in our supine media are both designed to foment anti-Semitism, to create fear among UK Jews, enough that they up sticks and move to Israel, hastening the end time. Hedy says, George, combining two of the topics tonight, I understand that one of the Sikh gurus is actually a book, The Wonderful Guru Granth Sahib, and regarded as an internal manifestation of the final sovereign guru. I don't go much into their religion, I just love them as people. LTHGB London says, more George Galloway on the airwaves, please. Makes a change to the local London station all the time. Even if you don't agree, that man makes you listen. Thank you very much. And this an SMS from Tom in Tottenham. George, great show as per The Riddle of the Sands. A fantastic, eccentric and intriguing tale of suspicion, espionage and all-round absurdity. Apparently a classic, though I doubt it's as well known as it should be. God bless and big love, Tom in Tottenham. Thanks for that, Tom. I haven't heard of that book. I'll look it up. Here's Paul in London on his favourite book. Go ahead, Paul.
Good evening, Mr. G. Fantastic show. My favourite, I was introduced to books by a history teacher, and he said, read 1984, which led on to Orwell. But the book that he sort of said to me, you're not going to understand, but I attempted, was Christopher Hill's The World Turned Upside Down. And he was a Welshman, and he said, just remember, sometimes the English aren't complete. And it was a fruity exchange, because obviously I live on the sort of ferocious fringes of London.
Right.
Yeah, and that book sort of...
well, Christopher Hill was a very, very great historian, great writer.
Yeah, I mean, it was a tough book to sort of get into at about 16, but as I've got older, it's sort of grown, and obviously it's led on to people like Chomsky and Zero Books, which does some pretty crazy stuff that I don't understand sometimes, but there are other little pamphlets that they do that sort of say, what you're told about the 1970s, it's really quite a lie.
Well, Paul, I've done an audiobook on the 1970s in which I seek to establish it is a very gigantic lie. The 1970s was a great decade. I believe it was the greatest decade, not just because I was a young Turk, a young Red Guard at the time, but because Britain was still something in the 1970s and had not yet begun its terrible decline, which began at the end of that decade. It's called Street Fighting, and it's my personal history of the 1970s. I recommend it to you as I would as I wrote it. It's an audiobook only. The Pocket Gods says, it's people like David Icke who have brought the protocols of the Elders of Zion back into the non-mainstream. In his ideas, he covers possible racism and anti-Semitism by referring to the rulers of the world as shape-shifting alien lizards. As you said, George, stay away. Stay away from David Icke. Stay away from the proven forgery, anti-Semitic cesspit called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Please. And the Pocket Gods goes on also, George, if I'd said Blojo's comments, I'd have been sacked from my job, and yet he's a possible new Prime Minister in waiting once the Chequers agreement falls. It's a very good point, you know. If you'd said what Johnson said, you would at the very least in any workplace be on a final written warning and quite possibly sacked. Isabel says, George, please don't forget Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. It's a great tome on reasons to not generalise racisms. Love your show, Katia. Thank you very much. Eva, working class, the working class poet, says, I sometimes feel quite ignorant when listening to some of the people who come on the mother of all talk shows. I have a lot to learn, but you've taught a lot of people a lot of things too, Eva. And Mountain Man says, Jeff Sparrow, no way but this, in search of Paul Robeson. For those who don't know, let me tell you that Paul Robeson was one of the greatest men who ever walked this planet. There's a one-man show touring. Try and catch it. Read, listen to Paul Robeson. He didn't just speak the very most beautiful things, but he did it in a voice like no other. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you, and if it was, come back tomorrow night. Bring another listener with you. Tomorrow night, the final mother of all talk shows of this week. And I won't be on next week until the following Friday. Stay tuned to Talk Radio.